Hello and welcome to the IACC Masterclasses. These are truly classes given by masters, people with mud on their boots, people who first-hand fought or committed corruption. Their stories go beyond the theory, beyond the grand ideas of what could and should be done, but they really give you first-hand advice on how to fight corruption. And in today's session, we're going to dive into behavior. What sets aside someone who stands up against corruption with someone who stands by, or someone who falls for it? What motivates someone to be corrupted? Is it greed? Is it just an opportunity? Is it jealousy? Or is it the need to feel alive, to escape the boredom and mediocrity? And what motivates someone to blow the whistle? Is it a deeply rooted belief in justice and fairness? Or is that jealousy or the need to escape boredom and mediocrity? And when the angel on your one shoulder is talking, what does the devil on the other shoulder say? And why do some people listen to this side or to that side, and some people don't listen at all? And actions have consequences. What do you do when you think about or get faced with the consequences? How does it further develop the choices that you make? Today, we're going to dive into this behavior and the motivations of people, because only if we understand what drives people, we're able to either make them not do it or really have the backs of the whistleblowers that they need so badly. And today, we're going to hear first-hand stories from someone who blew the whistle and someone who committed corruption. And ever since they've been faced with that, they devoted their lives to fighting corruption. Can I have a big round of applause for Richard Bistrong and Jonathan Taylor? Yes, come on to the... Hi, welcome. Hello, good afternoon. And they will be interviewed by Cecilia Muller Torabrand. Cecilia, you're the driving force of the establishment and now the leader of the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network. You're going to lead a discussion with these two very special cases that we have and these inspiring stories they're going to share. What do we hope to get out of this session? What do you hope to bring to our audience?
These are very personal stories that we will see today, personal stories of people who've taken different paths. And what we want to share with the audience today is reflections, but also lessons we can learn of these personal stories, of the choices being made. We also hope that we can dive into the human behavior, because we haven't really cracked the nut in terms of having good programs in place that makes it easy for people to take the right choice.
Wonderful. You're going to lead the discussion. Sometimes you're going to ask the audience what they would do. I am down there with a microphone to let them explain their choices and ask their questions later on in the session.
Thank you. Thank you. So again, warm welcome everybody to this the masterclass, but there is only one masterclass of today, so to dive into human behavior. My name is Cecilia Muller Torabrand, and I'm leading a global initiative that tackles maritime corruption. But I'm not here in the capacity of MACN. I'm really here to moderate a session with two gentlemen who have very personal stories to share. 20 years ago, companies under investigation may not have had so sophisticated programs. Today, when we're looking at settlements or investigation, we can see that companies do have programs in place. They have trainings, they have anti-corruption policy, yet we do see behaviors of many decisions are not made by ethical choices. And why is that? We also see global big surveys that show that people fear to speak up, fear to use whistleblowing systems, and even are discouraged to use these channels. Spending more than 10 years as a compliance officer for a multinational company, I'm intrigued by human behavior. Why do people act in a certain way? Why do they not speak up? Why do they make the choices they did? It is about avoiding landmines, but it's also about navigating the gray. And that's some of the elements we will spend 60 minutes together to discuss. But before I introduce the experts, I want to see a show of hands. And bear with me because this question is a bit provocative. So, how many people here think they could engage in some form of corruption? That was a bit surprising, right, gents? How many people believe they would always speak up if they saw or witnessed corruption? Okay. Can you remember your choices? Because this will be an important part of the session. Now, I want to turn to our experts of today. Richard Bistrong spent much of his career as an international sales executive, worked in a large publicly traded company. Over 10 years, Richard traveled to high-risk markets, did his work, and in 2007, he was targeted by a US FCPA investigation. Richard pleaded guilty in 2012 and served 14.5 months in prison for those choices. Today, he's an advocate for responsible decision-making in his client work. Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan is an award-winning whistleblower, a former corporate and in-house lawyer. He was a key witness in the Brazil's car wash operation and unearthed a multi-million-dollar corruption scandal with his former employer. Today, he's regarded as a leading whistleblower of the 21st century. I'm personally honored to have both of these gentlemen on stage at the IACC conference because they will bring so much knowledge to this anti-corruption compliance community. So I think we should just start by giving them a hand of applause to start off the session. Some may be familiar with their story, some may not. So I want to hand over to Richard, if you can summarize your story.
So thank you, Cecilia, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. As Cecilia described, my journey is one from commerce to corruption to compliance. And the commerce chapter started in my first role, which was the vice president of sales focused on the US market for a company that was not all that unique. It was in protective safety products. It was a publicly listed company, as Cecilia mentioned, and as a publicly listed company, there was intense pressure to succeed, right? That's nothing new. And in 1997, so I'm dating myself a little bit, I take the role as the international sales vice president of the same multinational. So just to be clear, before I start this new exciting job where I'll be spending 250 days a year overseas for 10 years, living in the United Kingdom, I sign the FCPA paperwork. So I understood the US anti-bribery law that paying a bribe either to win business or to keep it, either through yourself or through a third party, and that was my route to market, by the way. I used distributors, resellers, agents, intermediaries. That was how my market was going to work. Sign this paperwork and off I go. And I think last week, and I'm going to thank Helga for giving me his last 10 cards from last week's Oslo Anti-Corruption Conference. And there is a quote that I heard at the conference that 7% of global production is being siphoned off due to bribery and corruption. And that's the market that I was working in. I'm not saying that the US market was no risk and international was high risk. It was just a different type of risk. And I started thinking, and this story is one of accountability and responsibility, and no one's fault but my own. But starting to work in these high-risk and volatile markets, I started thinking, what does the company really want? Do they want these aggressive forecasts, targets, and objectives, or do they want me to abide by the US anti-bribery law that I signed off on? And instead of picking up the phone and asking for help, I took matters into my own hands and through conspiracies with third parties, I sacrificed integrity to succeed. And we know we never have to sacrifice integrity to succeed. But as Cecilia said, sometimes it's not so easy. And there's a great Transparency International report, I think going back to 2015, that talks about how sometimes the line between what's permissible and what's a violation can be a little gray. But I navigated this on my own. I violated the law through these conspiracies, and the investigators caught up with me 10 years later. I pleaded guilty to bribing foreign officials illegally and inappropriately to win and keep business. And I pleaded guilty for those offenses, ultimately served the 14.5 months in prison. I got home at the end of 2013 and started diving into the ethics and compliance and anti-bribery and transparency world, and saw so many great organizations, including this one right here, that were there to help people do the right thing. What I didn't see is anyone talking about what is it like to work in volatile and high-risk markets, to be tasked with success, and also to know that there was intense pressure to comply, right, to adhere to those laws. So I thought of myself as in the crosshairs of those two competing corporate objectives, and I started to write about it in my compliance blog. And I think ultimately this last stage of this journey, Cecilia, which started in 2013, is what brings us here today.
Yes. And I think this is an important story, bearing in mind how corporate cultures are created. And I think we can't hear enough, we can't analyze enough people's behavior relating to conflicting performance indicators, which I think is very common, if I may also be bold to put it there. We're now going to turn over to Jonathan, because your story is another path. So why don't you talk about the experience that you had, because your story had a different turn of events, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. I should say that it's really difficult for me to talk about this because it's so personal, and being a whistleblower has totally decimated my life. So forgive me if I'm sometimes difficult to follow, but it is an extraordinarily personal story. So I was the Deputy General Counsel at SBM Offshore. SBM Offshore is a Dutch listed company, and its main product is called floating production, storage and offloading units. So these are floating platforms that are often leased for 25 years plus over offshore under the seabed oil and gas reserves. So they're way too deep for traditional oil rigs, and something called a riser, big hose pipe, connects the well to the FPSO, and the oil is then processed and then stored in the hull up to 2 million barrels before shuttle tankers take it back and forth. So often these are in position for 25 years, often extended as well. And they lease for, when I was working at SBM, for about $500,000 per day. So big money. Predominantly the clients were the oil super majors and some national oil companies. As you can probably imagine, the concession production sharing agreements is very much controlled by the national oil and gas companies of wherever the vessels happen to be. And the key decision makers are in those companies. So, for example, Petrobras in Brazil, Sonangol in Angola, GE Petrol in Equatorial Guinea. So those are the people that make the decisions to determine who those oil majors can use, ultimately, to exploit their concession. 31st of January 2012, as a result of a number of events occurring, in a very binary moment, after 8.5 years with the company, I found out that corruption, the paying of bribes, was the central business model of the company. So at that moment, it involved a telephone call from external counsel to my general counsel, the rat was out of the bag. All those that knew about it was the board, certain people in accounts who literally paid the bribes, often through agents, and of course the entire sales and marketing department. It was quite a moment. I learnt within a week of that call, the company had paid over $250 million in bribes in the last 5 years up to 2012. Ultimately, I was frightened to death. I was now privy to this information and wanted to be able to share that information with others. Obviously, there was no compliance, no hotline, nothing to talk about, no one to go to within the company, as you might expect, because it was their central way of doing business. It was the bastion of how the company got business. Within 10 days, I just wanted to report. I didn't want to be associated with this mammoth corruption. I reported via lawyers to the SEC. I didn't care that ultimately they didn't have jurisdiction. I just wanted to let an external third party know. It wasn't an altruistic desire to highlight corruption. It was more just covering my own back at the time. SEC ultimately determined they didn't have jurisdiction because there had to really be New York Stock Exchange links. Yes, SBM had traded American depository receipts, but that wasn't enough. But I'd done my job in terms of getting that third party aware of the corruption. And they said the DOJ would definitely have jurisdiction, but at the time I did nothing further. It wasn't until the following year that I went public by telling all on SBM's Wikipedia page. I should say that the act of the rat coming out of the bag caused SBM to have to report at some level. They reported to the Dutch prosecutor and the DOJ, but they told them as little as possible. They tried to minimize the extent of the corruption, brought in a compliance officer at board level who decided he wanted to contain, which is a posh word for cover up, the extent of the bribes. They did such a good job that the DOJ decided they didn't have jurisdiction, and again, they told the absolute bare minimum to the Dutch. After my very public posting, I was suddenly very popular with multiple prosecutors. Probably the main impact I had was in Brazil, where I sort of influenced the kicking off of Operation Lava Jato car wash, which highlighted a whole load of other organizations, national organizations, engineering companies that had been entering into cartels and others that had been bribing Petrobras, as SBM had over 110 million in those 5 years up to 2012. A scandal followed, many arrests, many imprisonments. Even the former President Lula was imprisoned for taking bribes from Odebrecht, an engineering company in Brazil. And ultimately, the then President Dilma Rousseff was impeached. She used to be the chairperson of Petrobras, and she became the president of Brazil. And ultimately, she had to stand down. So it had quite an impact. By now, I was seeing, so we're now sort of fast forwarding to 2014, the Openbaar Ministry, so that's the FBI equivalents for the Dutch prosecutor. I was going in and out of Washington, seeing the FBI. I was seeing the Brazilian prosecutor. I was seeing the Serious Fraud Office. I was seeing the Swiss prosecutor, the French prosecutor, and other regulators. In total, SBM were fined close on $850 million, and it's still counting. So it's fair to say that my whistleblowing was extraordinarily successful. Former CEOs were imprisoned. Certain salespeople were imprisoned. I can't imagine how my whistleblowing could have been more effective. But as you'll learn soon, I paid a massive personal price for my whistleblowing.
So obviously 2 stories here that we want to bring, but the central of these stories are still human behavior, so that's what we're diving into, although as you can hear, the stories are very different. I want to go back to Richard here and just say, when and how was the first time you were kind of encountered with corruption?
So I am not deliberately naming countries here, because my experience with corruption was global, including the United States, because one of the bribery conspiracies that I was convicted of was bribing a public official, someone who worked for the United Nations, right in New York. So this can happen anywhere. But to wind back to former commercial Richard, I really would like to challenge you to think, what would you do in this situation? Because I think that's how we can make some difficult issues discussable. So this scenario was representative of my first 2 years in international business, where I'm sitting with one of my third parties, one of my intermediaries, and we're talking about a large public procurement tender. Not a small one, a large one. And I had no indication that there was any corrupt or even corrupt intent. This is what I thought of as a responsible business partner, and was helping for me to make technical sales presentations. I'm sure you can imagine selling an armored vehicle is not a simple sales process. So doing all these good things, and there's one that I remember very specifically where I'm really new in this role, so you can imagine, what do I want? I want to show the company that they made a good decision by giving someone with no international sales experience this international sales role. And he said, Richard, take a deep breath and relax. That's advice I should still follow. He said, because as part of my success and my success fee, because these intermediaries aren't making any money unless they're winning, he said, I'm paying tolls to win the business. Now, I grew up in New York City, and I know what a toll is. If you go over a bridge or under a tunnel, it's the rite of passage. And I didn't see any bridges or tunnels in these scenarios. So I knew what the counterparty meant by toll. And I have heard so many different words used to describe a bribe, from making people happy, to taking care of people, to sunshine payments, and almost every food you can imagine. Every word that you can think of other than bribe. But I think these words lead to a little bit of moral softening. Imagine if he would have said, Richard, how would you feel about participating in transnational crime? Like, I don't think my reaction would have been the same. And he wasn't asking me for anything, Cecilia. I mean, ultimately, you have to get the money to pay these bribes, to pay these tolls. But not in this conversation. He's just saying, this is how we get it done. So what did I do? I just nodded my head. I figured, who am I to get between this big order, my company, and this huge opportunity? And right there, by nodding my head with the understanding that a bribe was going to be paid, even though a bribe had not been paid, just by nodding my head, I violated the U.S. anti-bribery law. Now, that's not what I went to prison for, but I just want you to think, this was my first 2 years of experience in international business. And Cecilia, I wanted to keep my standards of personal and corporate integrity high, but not if it put me at a competitive disadvantage. And due to no one's fault but my own, that's how I started to look at my sales environment.
And this is, I think, one of the common arguments we'll still see today. This is how the market works. There are like these arguments that we hear over and over again. So, which is very relatable to the nodding, right? But I still want to challenge you here because you knew that it was illegal, right? So why didn't you just pick up the phone? Were you concerned about the reply on the other end, or were you really wanting to be successful? What went through your mind when you did that nodding, right?
So early on, so this was a 10-year international sales experience. And I know it sounds easy. Why didn't you just pick up the phone and ask for help, right? You don't have to sacrifice integrity to succeed. And I know that sounds easy. But at least in the first 2 years, I'm thinking, if I keep calling the company up and saying, I'm competent, I love this job, but I'm confused, like I need support in how I'm supposed to succeed with integrity, I'm thinking, if I keep making that call, at some point they're going to think, maybe we gave you the wrong job. Maybe we need to hire someone that does have significant international sales experience because you seem to be struggling. And there's research upon research. No one likes just instinctually to admit that they're struggling. So I could have picked up the phone. That would have saved me 14 and a half months in prison. But instead, I asked the wrong question is, does the company really want to know what it's like out here? And I decided on their behalf that they didn't.
And why do you think that's so difficult for people to speak up? Is it because we're still driven by the incentives, the conflicts in what we're supposed to deliver? Because this is a crucial element to see why people are making the choices they're making.
So speaking up, and I not enjoy, but I appreciate Jonathan's testimony on this, is it goes against every instinct we have. We are fearful. We fear retaliation. We fear that nothing's going to happen if we speak up. And we also fear, and there's surveys upon surveys about this, that we fear that the company's going to mishandle it if we speak up. So, I mean, there's just two great books on this that have the deep research, The Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson, and Speak Up by Megan Reitz. It just goes against everything that's in our instinct. We fear speaking up, which is why I think maybe we can shift the conversation to, instead of speaking up, maybe we can be better listeners, right? If we just think of the terms speak up, open door policy, whistleblowing, who's the pressure on? The pressure's on Jonathan. Where maybe if we can train ourselves to be better listeners, that people will feel more comfortable speaking up, not only about the risks that they observe, but about themselves as well.
So with that, I want to also bridge over to Jonathan here. I mean, you sat there by your desk, discovering or got the phone call, discovered the misconduct. You talked about how you made a decision, but what made you to take that decision and speak up?
So again, I was in a state of absolute shock. Going to work was like crossing the lines in World War I. It was a terrible environment. At the same time, the New York Times wrote a really good article about the bribes that Walmart were paying in order to get planning permission to build stores in Mexico. And that article focused a lot on lawyers, in-house lawyers and external lawyers, which even put the fear of God further into me. I saw the extent of the bribes, 250 million over 5 years. It went way more if you kept going back. It was even paying the Workers' Party, so it was undermining democracy. That was the Workers' Party in Brazil during the second election campaign for President Lula. I was just focusing on the extent of the corruption and the nature of the corruption, and I didn't want to have anything to do with it. People were running around, obviously wanting to cover up the extent of the corruption. Board members were shredding really important documents. My then boss, until he resigned, was being told not to go and trouble Angola, not to look at certain individuals. People were running around like headless chickens. Obviously didn't want anything to do with it. There was no internal compliance to speak of. Thus, I felt I had absolutely no choice but to go to the authorities just to mark their card. Sure, the SEC did nothing, notwithstanding that Petrobras was one of the recipients of all the bribes, and 50% of their shares are traded, of course, on the New York Stock Exchange. Madoff is nothing compared to the SEC not doing anything at the time. Ultimately, 200 million, by the way, dollars was wiped off what was the biggest company in the Southern Hemisphere at one point, Petrobras. So I just had no choice. I had to do something. I was right in the battle lines now, and I couldn't continue without reporting.
What's interesting about these stories is that you were standing at a crossroad, and both of these gents took different turns. Because in your case, Richard, you could have become a whistleblower. You could have spoken up, and you took a different path. You could have easily covered it up. You were a corporate lawyer, right? So I want to chat. Wouldn't that have been an easier choice, just to continue as everybody else?
No, because I feared now I could have been an associate to the crime, because I had that knowledge, and I feared my shoulder being taken, and my ending up with some kind of offence for being associated with this crime, which SBM were now avidly and actively trying to cover up. And I knew at the extent of the crime, and I knew that they were trying to cover up. Ultimately, I left in the June because I couldn't be dealing with this compliance officer that was appointed at board level, who was openly talking about containing the corruption and trying to keep it to as narrow an area as possible. One of the relatively minor bribes, only 7 or so million in Equatorial Guinea. So no, I didn't hesitate in going forward, because I figured I could be a victim myself of the corruption.
And I think what's put extra pressure on Jonathan here is also the fact that I think one of the big purposes with whistleblower systems is that you're supposed to take the pressure off the employee, right? I mean, when I worked as a compliance officer, I was involved in a lot of investigations and rolling out the whistleblower system. One of the things to say, this is like when you don't trust your manager to come, you should come to us, and you should feel secure that someone is actually helping you with the concerns, the red flags you may hear. If it's Angola, if it's Sweden, it doesn't matter where it is, you can come to the company. So as we talked about your story, there were no whistleblowing systems, and the question is if that would have mattered, because the misconduct sat very high up in the company anyway. But there is an extra pressure put on you at that time, because you decide not only to escalate it, you decide to escalate it externally, right? Because you felt you had to give this to someone. It's how we talked about psychology. It's the same thing. You sit with this information. You need to take it off your chest. You fear for your own consequences. So I want to go back to that moment. So when was the moment where you decided not only I need to blow the whistle, but I need to take this to someone who can help me and would hopefully put some protection over me, which we will come to. But talk to me about that moment.
So literally within 10 days, at the 31st of January, given what I was witnessing, I talked about the shredding, I talked about the General Counsel being put under pressure not to investigate certain parts of the corruption. I saw a board and started seeing evidence of board members literally signing up to agency agreements under which bribes were paid. I realized that there was no one I could talk to within the company. I was trapped and had no choice but to go external. Plus, the New York Times asked for putting the fear of God into me. It wasn't a difficult. It was a really tough thing to do, but it wasn't a difficult decision to make.
But how do you even know where to go? I mean, just like, did you sit and say, oh, I should go to the SEC? Like, what made you then to say, oh, I'm going to go here, I'm going to contact this line? Was that?
I didn't want to go immediately to prosecutors. So obviously now the cat was out of the bag. SBM had to report and reported to like I made reference to the Dutch and to the Americans, but with as little information as possible. I thought the SEC, so not a public prosecutor in itself, would have been a good first stop. As I say, just to inform them, the fact they didn't have jurisdiction mattered not. I just wanted to go to someone to report the knowledge that I had learned.
Thank you. And I mean, this is the questions now we're asking is around human behavior. What made you take those decisions? What made you cover up the decisions you're making? So, but especially in your case, Richard, I think many people would like to know is what could have stopped you at that point, right?
So what could have stopped this story before it started? That's the one I had 14 and a half months in prison to think about, right? Again, I didn't take this new role to end up in prison. I was pretty excited about it. So imagine if before I took that first flight, I was sitting down with not only a former compliance Cecilia, but her business peer as well, right? Someone representing not only the voice of ethics and compliance, but someone representing the voice of the organization, the business side. And Guro Sedermark, another one of my Norwegian friends from the TI Norway, had a great quote last week. She said, "We need to find a common language to talk about these challenges." So imagine having that conversation with business and ethics, talking about, look, Richard, we want you to succeed in this new role, but it's inevitable that you're going to come in contact with corruption and corruption risk. Just say no. That's a wall poster. That actually doesn't help you, because your experience with corruption in South America will be much different than your experience in the Middle East. So we want to prepare you for these challenges before you're in the middle of them. We want you to understand that we have resources here to support you, and we're not going to compensate you in a way, which, by the way, was how I was compensated, with an eat what you kill reward plan. So we have a great heritage, we have great technology, we have a great balance sheet. We don't have to pay someone to win business. We will do this the right way and in a way that's sustainable. And Richard, if the voice of get it done ever drowns out the voice of we always care how you're getting things done, let's have this conversation again. And I think, Cecilia, the reason why that conversation, and it's speculative, might have changed this trajectory is because it was coming from both of those voices. So I'm not feeling like, what does the corporation really want? Ethics and compliance or sales success? Because I'm talking to all of them together. What Guro talked about is we're finding that common language.
And also maybe if things are too good to be true, they maybe are too good to be true. It's also about the human element of daring to pick up the phone and say, you have really good results in a high-risk market. How are you doing?
So who wants to question success, right? And if we're not careful, as we see in Cecilia, we all continue to see this in our anti-bribery world, we see a lot of bad behavior, as in my case, hiding behind good performance until it's too late for everyone. But whose responsibility is it to question success? Maybe that's a good question point at some point.
Of course, both of these stories have had consequences, so we want to move in from the human behavior and deep dives of the story to go into, because there were consequences on both ends, which I don't want to start with you here. And the consequences are, I think, twofold. It's both the external environment and, of course, your personal consequences as well. But let's talk about, today you remain and are a global voice for ethics and compliance, and you've made it kind of your life choice to turn that around. But were you losing any sleep during those years, those 10 years, and did you feel like, or was it just it's a win-win for everybody? Because we are quite good as humans to kind of justify our actions. So were you thinking about the consequences? Were you thinking about the victims? Were you thinking about the impact of society? It sounds very grand scale, but was that even crossing your mind? And if not, how do we get people to see those consequences?
So I wasn't losing any sleep, and especially because I was selling life-saving equipment, right? Bullet-resistant vests, armored vehicles. Sometimes I was getting the product there faster and at less cost to the corruption. And I think this is a huge blind spot from the commercial perspective, because it's so easy, and it's hard for me to admit this, especially here. I thought of it as a win-win, that no one was getting hurt. And there's a great book called Blind Spots, not surprisingly, by Max Bazerman and Ann Tenbrunsell. And it talks about if we think of ethics and compliance as only policies, rules, and procedures, that it distorts our behavior instead of helping it, because we might think, oh, there's not a rule for this, that means I get to do it, right? That it's permissible. So I think we have to really be on the lookout for this win-win mindset. Like, I did not connect my decision-making with how even petty corruption harms local societies, how it distracts and destroys good governance, economic development. I didn't think that bribery was a human rights issue. I thought of corruption as just this commercial issue. So the question is, and as I learned the hard way, right, with this blind spot of I'm not hurting anyone, right? After all, the company's getting the sales, I'm making my bonus, the country gets a great product. You know, there's still no right way to do the wrong thing. So I think for everyone here today, you can have such an impact to help mitigate this blind spot by helping the commercial Richards to connect their decision-making to the communities and the societies where they work, where they reside, and to help them understand that there are serious ethical consequences for their conduct, positive and negative. And that's what the whole book Blind Spots speaks to, is help with awareness of the ethical consequences, not just the legal consequences. And there are some great books out there to help people understand this. And it was wonderful. I ran into Sarah Chase yesterday, and her book, Thieves of State, is a wonderful primer to help people understand the ethical and the societal consequences of their conduct.
But also because when we see those ethical, societal consequences, they're often very big. So be able to look at those consequences and then relate to what are you doing here and there, right? It's a huge gap between, I mean, you really have to take a deep dive into understanding how does my action relate to these big societal consequences. I think we also have to be better to kind of articulate that. What is actually the consequences?
Cecilia, I have some clients that actually have volunteer programs where people do public works volunteering in some of these societies, so they really experience firsthand, the impact that they can have on local communities.
Good. I mean, blowing the whistle, as you did, Jonathan, is not just about, we're going to get the bad apples, we're gonna get the bad management here. It's also, there are also, I mean, colleagues and friends who may work with the company that they're also, who may not be directly involved in the scheme and the larger scheme of things. So did you think there will be, did you reflect on the consequences for this? But you worked in the company for quite some time. Did you reflect on those consequences?
To be honest, not at the time. I was like a cat caught in the headlights. I should say that where I was working was Monaco, that prior state of Monaco, and it was the biggest private sector employer in the Principality. It was the darling of the prince. He would go just to open creches. They would go on trade missions together. They issued stamps celebrating SBM's products. I should mention that back in September 2014, SBM reported me to the Monegasque authorities for the frivolous and vexatious accusation of attempted extortion. They were paying huge amounts in social taxes to the government. So it was beyond just employees at SBM, who of course were affected. The SBM couldn't bid in Brazil for over 5 years. A former friend's wife gave my then wife a hard time because of the share price plummeting. There was a lot of bad feeling because a lot of people's jobs were then much more difficult to do. Indeed, SBM publicly, in a lawsuit it attempted against me, literally said that I brought the company to its knees. So yes, there was a lot of bad feeling beyond just SBM. I mean, most of the stories of BBC Online on Monaco, about a third of the stories about the Grand Prix, a third of the stories about Djokovic and other sports persons, and the rest are about what I did in Monaco. So I was bringing it such bad publicity. So yeah, there are a lot of people affected by what I did, and I became quickly public enemy number one within the Principality.
And that's a good segue into, I mean, we talked about the external consequences, and then there are the personal consequences for both of these stories. So I want to, start with you, Richard, here, and can you talk us through some of the personal consequences?
Well, I don't need any note cards for that, and I would say they were catastrophic. So, these are letters from my daughter, from my sister, to me when I was in federal prison. I had 2 young adult children at the time, and at a time in their life where self-awareness and self-confidence is fragile at best. They were embarrassed, they were socially ridiculed, their friends couldn't come to the house, because there were newspaper articles like in the New York Times, in the local paper, in Florida, where I was living. So, all the people that I thought I was doing great by, right? My company with all these big orders, remember back to my win-win, my family taking my children on all these vacations, like those were the people that I hurt the most. And, and due to no one's fault but my own, it had such a catastrophic effect, on their lives, and we continue to repair those. So, some may be thinking, why did they bring a former corruption violator to talk about corruption here at the IACC? Like, you can be a former felon or you can help us with ethics and compliance. You can't do both. Just so you know, I struggle with the same thing. Because as excited as I am to be here, and Cecilia knows, and Roberto knows, I'm pretty excited to be here, is as much as I wish I was doing anything else and had made other decisions and better decisions that didn't put me up on this stage. And I also appreciate that most former felons, are looking for a job, they're looking for housing, they are ostracized from society, and they don't get a second chance. So just know how much I appreciate, Transparency International and IACC for allowing me to come here, and for giving, and to all of you for hopefully opening your hearts and your minds and giving me that second chance. So thank you.
This is a tough question for you, I know that. But following up on Richard, I've also had the luxury to actually moderate both of these gens separately before, so we've had long conversations. But following on Richard's, of course, reflection on the personal price and personal consequences, do you want to share that?
Right, I mean, this is really the gist of my message. So I managed to get another job as a contractor prior to that Wikipedia entry being published, and my name becoming very much in the public domain. And fortunately, my employer just told me, look, John, if things get too much, you must tell us. But they stayed loyal to me, I stayed loyal to them, and I continued working up until 2020. 30th of July 2020 was a life-changing day for me. It was in between lockdowns, went on holiday with my 3 children and my wife to Dubrovnik. Upon arrival in Dubrovnik, I was arrested under an Interpol red notice. So Interpol red notices is normally the preserve of drugs barons, warlords, serious rapists, murderers, etc. I was arrested on suspicion of bribery and corruption. I was held in Croatia on the basis now that it was Monaco, through Interpol, was seeking to extradite me to Monaco. I was there 2 weeks short of 1 year. So there were huge consequences of that. My 25-year-old marriage came to an abrupt end. The pressure on the family was too much to bear. Unsurprisingly, I'm now unemployed. I cannot get back into my industry. I'm now in my 50s, been unemployed for almost 4 years. I'm a whistleblower. There's still stigma attached to whistleblowing. And I was sought after by Interpol and, of course, a very public Monaco fight trying to get me over there. Ultimately, the Supreme Court in Croatia determined that I should be extradited. And then in July, we're now 2021, the Minister of Justice determined that should not occur, and that decision was overruled. By now, there was an emergency question in the House of Commons and then in the House of Lords. And of course, my plight was becoming very public knowledge. I now live a very isolated life, alone, obviously without my family. Short of taking my own life, which was never going to happen, the consequences of my whistleblowing could not have been worse. 3 years, about 2015, after I left SBM, I was served with a writ for defamation, so a SLAP, a strategic lawsuit against public participation. And yes, it did have the required or sought-after chilling effect on me. I was being sued for saying that SBM had paid over 250 million in bribes in the 5 years up to 2012. I was sued for saying that there had been attempts to cover up. I was sued for saying that they weren't forthright and timely in their announcements to shareholders. Of course, we filed a defense. I found a great lawyer, Otto Volgenant of Books, law firm in Amsterdam. I was sued in Rotterdam. And we just filed a defense and 158 exhibits, and lo and behold, the case was withdrawn. But it wasn't inexpensive, and yeah, that was extremely stressful. But as I say, what was to come in 2020 was the real impact. Ultimately, I voluntarily went to see the investigating judge in Monaco after I'd been sent back to the UK, and he determined, this is now October 2021, that there was no case for me to answer. So the accusation was that I had attempted to extort SBM. It was frivolous and vexatious. There was never even a charge, because he had to determine whether or not to charge me. The prosecutor, of course, appealed that decision, and the matter went to the Criminal Appeal Court in Monaco, and they upheld the decision of the investigating judge in determining that I had no case to answer. But this was now all too late. William Bourdon, who acted for Ed Snowden, amongst many other whistleblowers, whilst I was still in Croatia, he made an arrangement with the investigating judge that I could come to Monaco, 17th of December, which was ultimately, 8 months before I was released. I was thrown in prison for 5 or 6 days as well, by the way, at the beginning. He determined, it was agreed that I would see the investigating judge on the 17th of December, and he would question me, which is exactly what would have happened if the extradition had been successful. Except, of course, the prosecutor the protocol is that you have to withdraw the request for extradition in the country where the subject matter is, the target is, wouldn't do that. It was just an act of total spite. I have no doubt whatsoever that came from above. No doubts whatsoever, because I caused such havoc to the Principality of Monaco. Slaps, what else? I mean, I would say the year of my life was taken away from me, but arguably ever since the 30th of July, my life has never, of course, been the same. Yeah, that'll do for now.
And I think what's interesting about your case, we have to remember that his was also, an in-house corporate counsel. I mean, there are many whistleblowers out there who doesn't sit with that legal background you had, or the corporate background, or the net of contacts. So we can just see the scale of this problem, really, for whistleblowers who choose to speak up, which I think is very important also to remember. And I know there's been a lot of topics on this also at the conference, right? There are two burning questions that we want to, ask both of you, and I'm just going to go back to you, Richard, and just, have you forgiven yourself?
If I answer yes and no, I've covered both sides. I think yes, from the respect that when I was contacted by the Department of Justice, I immediately admitted my wrongdoing. I wanted to face justice and not delay it, and knew that I had to come clean with society, with my family, with justice, to change the trajectory of my life. So from the perspective of, I started making some good decisions about my future after a decade of bad decisions, and went to prison for it. I've forgiven myself in that it's a very conscious forgiveness, but the regret of what I did, the regret of how it impacted my family and my relationships and my friendships, I think I can forgive myself, but I think I'll regret this to some extent. I think it's just perpetual.
I mean, the obvious question, I think, which I had in the back of my mind from the first conversations we had, until I think many of us are thinking about, would you do it again?
Obviously not. I mean, I'd be insane to answer that question positively. I'm probably the most prominent whistleblower, corporate whistleblower, so far this century. My life has been decimated by my whistleblowing. There simply is not the protection that there should be for whistleblowers out there. My life will never be the same. It was the worst decision I ever made.
So now, we're coming to the end of this session, and I want you all to reflect on the same questions as we had in the beginning of the session. Do you remember what those were? So I want to hear if anyone has changed their opinion. You can raise your hand in terms of, would you engage in corruption? Has anyone changed their perspective? Anyone raise their hand if they changed their perspective? Any change of hands when it comes to, would you report it? Anyone who said yes in the beginning, and now, would you still report misconduct of corruption that you saw?
Really?
No one does. We're just going to ask, hello, what did you say in the beginning, and do you still stand by it?
Yeah, my name is Helge Kvamme from Norway. I'm a corporate investigator and has a background from law enforcement, economic crime investigation, so it's difficult to me to admit that I would have been corrupt. To the second question, we also, together with Guru, who is beside me, we are running an Oslo anti-corruption conference. So instead of commenting on that question, I'd like to say, unfortunately, Jonathan, you are not alone. We have had 2 whistleblowers at the conference in Oslo. Both had to run or fight for their life, and one is on the run, in fact, today, fighting for his life. And the companies they're represented are major Western European, even Nordic companies. And we heard earlier today that each year, $1 trillion is paid every year in bribes to public official, and the source of those funds are basically from the Western world.
If it would happen to you, would you stand up? Or would you take Jonathan's advice?
Well, in fact, I was in a position as an investigator, and I didn't report, and I have been thinking about that many years afterwards. But listening to Jonathan, I totally agree with him. You must be insane to go into that world.
Okay, well, that gives a lot of hope. Let's ask someone else. May I ask you, would you still dare to say that you would never engage in corruption, always stand up?
I actually said that I kept my hand down for the first question. No, I said that there would be situations where maybe, like, there would be a situation where it was difficult, like, for example, what Richard described, to know that you were doing the right thing, or, you know, sometimes even just in a stupid sense, I'll find it hard to speak up. I'll be a people pleaser or something like that, that in that snap moment, you might not catch what you're involved in, and, you know, it would be easy to say that you wouldn't, but I think you need to be humble enough to know that's not the case. And I didn't actually say that I would do what Jonathan did, and the reason for that is I've actually heard Jonathan speak before, and I've heard about his case, and I think it's very compelling. And in the past, I worked for Transparency International UK, and I remember what was happening to Jonathan at the time, so I saw it firsthand.
Thank you.
We should always be humble, especially when we hear from Jonathan.
I think, I mean, obviously we still don't want to end this masterclass with only these stories, right? We want to share some learnings, because that's also the purpose of the class that we also, I want to go to Jonathan here and say, if there are 3 things you want the audience to be inspired by, and also that you want them to bring with them out of this session, give me 3 things.
Sure, protection, protection, protection. So I was wrung dry by all those prosecutors I mentioned who's raised almost $1 billion, yet none of them, you know, once I was hung out to dry after I've been wrung, none of them came to my assistance. No one amongst all those I'd made so much money for in fines and prosecutions came to help me. There needs to be vigorous, robust international laws that protects people like me, so that I don't have to admit that it was the worst decision of my life being a whistleblower. And they simply aren't there at the moment. So protection is what is required and what is absent.
Absolutely lacking, yes. Over to you, Richard. What are the top 3 things you want the audience to take away from this session?
Risk can sneak up on us, and as research, and I'm happy to share some of this academic research, we way overestimate how well we will do if we're confronted with an ethical dilemma, and then we way overscore ourselves in how we did after we faced an ethical dilemma. So I think if we can appreciate that it's not always easy to navigate the gray, we can help people who work and reside and are tasked with success in these difficult situations. And I think the other part is blind spots convince us that we don't have any. And how do we get people to realize their blind spot? It's not just what we think of as traditional ethics and compliance. As much as you can, get your business leaders involved. Right? Who do we listen to the most? I didn't invent this rule. We listen to the people that we report to, right? Our supervisors. And when ethical and responsible business practices are coming from the voice of business, they sound so much louder. And I think, you know, the final thing I would encourage everyone to do, and I know this isn't easy, is sometimes we just need to look in the mirror and, you know, and challenge ourselves, right? What would I do under these circumstances? Because if we do look and think about these difficult issues and how we might respond, I think we can then better help people who face these issues each and every day in their work and roles.
So with that, I think we should just thank the gentlemen for sharing their stories. We're just in time. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And they are hanging around, so I'm sure if you want to ask questions, they're still here. So that is also something.
Thank you,
I'm
Cecilia.
sure you would
Thank you,
offer.
Jonathan.
Thank you,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much for your stories. I think this is really a big class in humbleness, I think, that summarizes it more or less. I hope we all can work on our blind spots and still find courage. Thank you so much. You touched also a lot on how important culture is. Tomorrow, at our last masterclass, we'll go deeper into what is a good culture that brings out the best in people, maybe amidst all these blind spots. That's tomorrow at 9 a.m., but not after we give one big applause to our speakers of today.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much.